My name is Eliza Moreau, and the first thing I learned about silence is that it isn't empty. It breathes. It waits. It presses its weight against your back when you think you're alone. The morning I heard it heavy, slow breathing behind me, the fog was so thick it swallowed the horizon whole. The world had narrowed to a pale corridor of damp air and muted sound, the kind that makes your thoughts echo too loudly inside your skull. I remember thinking that if I stopped walking, I might dissolve into it, become another shape the mist refused to explain. I didn't stop. I never do. Stopping has always felt dangerous, like if I paused for even a second, everything I keep carefully stacked inside me would collapse outward. So I walked, boots sinking into wet earth, hands buried deep in my coat pockets, breath shallow, controlled, practiced. The breathing followed. It wasn't human. I knew that instantly. In the way you know something before your mind catches up, your body reacting faster than thought. It was deeper, warmer, rhythmic in a way that didn't match panic or pursuit. Still, my shoulders tightened, my spine stiffened. Old instincts don't need logic. I told myself not to turn around. I told myself the land makes sounds, that fog carries echoes, that fear invents monsters when it's bored. I told myself a lot of things that morning. None of them quieted the feeling that I was no longer alone. The path curved gently through the field, bordered by skeletal trees stripped bare by late autumn. Somewhere to my left, a fence creaked, wood complaining softly as it shifted in the cold. The breathing grew closer, not louder, closer, as if whatever followed wasn't trying to catch me, only to keep pace. I slowed before I realized I was doing it. That was my first mistake. The breath slowed too. I stopped. The world seemed to hold its own breath with me. Fog curled around my legs, cold and insistent. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, too fast, too sharp. I stood there, frozen between the urge to flee and the strange pull to stay, my back prickling with awareness. Then I turned. He stood there like something pulled from another time tall, still, impossibly solid against the shifting mist. A horse, his coat dark as wet earth, mane tangled with dew. His nostrils flared softly as he breathed, sending small clouds of steam into the air between us. His eyes caught what little light there was, deep and reflective, not startled, not aggressive, just present. For a moment, neither of us moved. I felt ridiculous for the fear flooding me, but fear doesn't vanish just because it's embarrassed. My fingers curled inside my pockets, nails biting into my palms. I had grown up around animals, dogs, cats. The occasional stubborn goat at my aunt's place, but this was different. He was bigger than any memory I had, heavier, his stillness carrying a gravity I couldn't ignore. He took one step forward. The ground seemed to answer him, a dull thud beneath his weight. My breath caught. Every sensible thought screamed at me to back away, to put distance between my fragile body and his powerful one. Instead, I stood there like the fog had rooted me in place. He stopped again, head lowering slightly, ears angled forward. Not threatening. Curious. I realized then that the breathing I'd heard, the sound that had wound itself so tightly around my nerves, wasn't ominous at all. It was steady, calm, almost grounding. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "I'm not supposed to be here," I whispered, though I didn't know why I said it. The words drifted uselessly into the fog. He flicked an ear, as if acknowledging the sound rather than the meaning. The land this path cut through wasn't mine. It belonged to the old estate at the edge of town, the one people spoke about in half-sentences and nostalgic sighs. I rented a small cottage nearby, close enough to walk when the noise inside my head got too loud. I had never seen a horse out here before. I wasn't even sure there were still animals on the property. Yet, here he was. Something in his gaze made it impossible to treat him like a mistake. Slowly, deliberately, I withdrew one hand from my pocket, palm open, fingers stiff with cold. I didn't reach for him. I just let my hand exist between us, an offering without expectation. My pulse hammered, but there was a strange steadiness creeping in beneath it, like a second rhythm syncing with my own. He lowered his head further, breath warming my knuckles before his muzzle even touched me. The contact, when it came, was feather light, a soft brush, barely there. I flinched despite myself, then forced my muscles to relax. His breath tickled my skin. I laughed under my breath, a short, incredulous sound that surprised us both. His head lifted, eyes sharp for a heartbeat, then softened again when I didn't move away. "I'm sorry," I murmured, though I didn't know what I was apologizing for. The laugh, the fear, my presence. We stood like that for a long time, suspended in the fog. No sudden movements, no demands. Just two beings sharing the same cold air, listening to each other breathe. Eventually, the chill seeped deeper into my bones, reminding me that time still existed. I stepped back, careful, slow. He didn't follow this time. He simply watched, ears flicking, breath steady. As I turned away and resumed walking, my steps felt different, heavier, yet oddly more anchored. The fog thinned as the path led me back toward the cottage, the world gradually reclaiming its edges. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I felt him there long after the sound of his breathing faded. That encounter should have been a fluke, a strange, mist-bound moment I could fold away and forget. But some things don't allow themselves to be forgotten. The days that followed carried a restless undercurrent. I found myself listening more closely to silence, half expecting it to breathe back. Sleep came in fragments, my dreams crowded with shapeless fields and dark eyes watching from the edges. When I woke, there was an unfamiliar ache in my chest, not pain, exactly, more like anticipation stretched too thin. I returned to the path the next morning and the one after that. At first, I told myself it was habit, routine. I needed the walks, needed the air, the movement, but the truth pressed against me with every step. I was listening. The fog didn't always come. Sometimes the sky was clear and pale, the fields washed in weak sunlight. Sometimes rain flattened the world into shades of gray. Regardless, I walked the same path, my senses tuned outward in a way they hadn't been for years. On the fourth morning, I heard him before I saw him. The breathing was softer this time, farther away. I stopped without thinking, a strange calm settling over me like a familiar coat. When I turned, he was there again, standing just beyond the fence line now, head lifted, watching me with that same quiet focus. Relief flooded me so suddenly it left me dizzy. I hadn't realized how much I'd been holding onto the memory of him until he stood there, solid and real, erasing the fear that I'd invented it all. I approached the fence slowly, keeping my movements deliberate. He didn't retreat. He didn't advance. "Hi," I said, the word feeling inadequate and necessary all at once. The fence was old but sturdy, its wood worn smooth by time. I rested my forearms against it, leaning forward slightly. He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the faint scars along his flank, the subtle gray threading through his dark coat. He wasn't young. There was history written into him, lines and marks that spoke of years lived fully, if not gently. "Do you live here?" I asked softly. He exhaled, long and slow, steam blooming in the cool air. The sound vibrated through me in a way I couldn't explain. It felt like standing near a deep note played on a cello, low, resonant, grounding. I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, my vision blurred unexpectedly. I brushed at my cheek with the back of my hand, annoyed by the sudden sting. Crying had never come easily to me. I had trained myself out of it years ago, teaching my body that tears were inefficient, unhelpful. Yet here they were, uninvited, reacting to a presence that hadn't asked anything of me at all. "I'm not broken," I told him quietly, though the words trembled. "I just got bent out of shape." He shifted his weight, one hoof scraping lightly against the ground. The sound anchored me, real, physical, unconcerned with my internal mess. I started talking then because silence with him felt different, less oppressive, more like an invitation. I told him things I hadn't said out loud in years, things that sat too heavy in my chest to carry alone, but too vague to share with people who wanted neat explanations. I talked about leaving the city, about the noise that had followed me even into sleep. I talked about the way grief can linger without a name, how it can attach itself to you like a shadow you stop questioning. He listened. I know how that sounds. I know the skepticism it invites. But there was a quality to his stillness that felt intentional, as if every flick of his ear, every shift of muscle, was part of a quiet conversation happening below the level of language. When I finally fell silent, my throat tight and raw, he leaned forward until his forehead rested gently against the top rail of the fence. The contact sent a small shock through me, not of fear, but of something like recognition. I mirrored him without thinking, pressing my own forehead lightly against the wood, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. We breathed together, separated by inches and years and entirely different lives, yet somehow meeting in the middle. The world didn't change in some dramatic, cinematic sweep. There was no swelling music, no sudden clarity. But something inside me shifted, subtle as a tide turning. I stayed longer than I meant to that day, longer than the cold warranted. When I finally stepped back, my legs stiff and numb, he watched me go with calm acceptance. No chasing, no protest, just presence. I walked home feeling like I'd left something behind and carried something new with me all at once. Over the next weeks, our meetings became a quiet ritual. Some days he was there when I arrived, waiting by the fence as if he'd sensed me coming. Other days, I would walk the path alone, the absence strangely comforting rather than disappointing. It taught me patience, trust. I learned the patterns of his moods through small signs, the angle of his ears, the set of his shoulders, the way his breathing changed with the weather. I learned to match my own pace to his, to let my thoughts settle into the steady rhythm he offered without effort. I never touched him beyond those brief, tentative moments. It felt important not to rush, not to claim more than what was given freely. Our bond grew in the spaces between gestures, in the shared stillness that asked nothing and offered everything. Sometimes, as I leaned against the fence, I would think about how strange it was that the most grounded I had felt in years came not from conversation or understanding, but from standing quietly beside a creature who didn't need me to explain myself. The heavy breathing that had once filled me with fear became a comfort. A reminder that I wasn't alone in the fog, that something steady existed just beyond my line of sight, waiting not to follow, but to accompany. And though I didn't know it yet, that sound was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke before dawn with the echo of it still moving through me, as if my body had memorized the cadence of his breath. The cottage was cold, the kind of cold that seeps through floorboards and settles into your joints, but I lay there for a long moment anyway, staring at the ceiling as pale gray light slowly gathered at the edges of the room. There was a strange alertness in me, a quiet readiness, like I was waiting for something to arrive, even though I didn't know what shape it would take. I dressed without turning on the lights. Wool sweater, worn jeans, the same boots by the door. My movements felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if I were careful not to disturb whatever fragile calm had followed me home the day before. When I stepped outside, the air cut sharp and clean into my lungs. The fog was lighter today, stretched thin and silvered by early light, but it still clung to the ground, softening the world's edges. I walked the path with an ease that surprised me. My steps fell into a rhythm that felt less like escape and more like arrival. With each breath, I noticed how my shoulders dropped, how my jaw unclenched. It was subtle, but undeniable. Something about returning here, about the possibility of him, quieted the constant low-level vigilance I'd carried for so long, I'd forgotten it wasn't normal. He wasn't there when I first reached the fence. I stopped anyway. The absence didn't tighten my chest the way it might have days earlier. Instead, it felt like part of the conversation we were having unspoken, but ongoing. I rested my hands on the top rail, the wood cool and familiar beneath my palms, and let myself simply be. The field stretched out before me, dew catching the light, the grass bending gently in a breeze I could barely feel. I breathed. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time felt different here, looser, less insistent. When I finally heard the sound of hooves on damp earth, it came from my right, unhurried and steady. I didn't turn immediately. I waited until the breathing reached me, warm and deep. A presence I recognized now not with fear, but with something dangerously close to relief. He came into view slowly, emerging from behind a stand of trees, like a thought taking shape. He stopped several feet away this time, head lifted, ears forward. The distance between us felt intentional, a boundary neither of us rushed to cross. "Good morning," I murmured. Saying it out loud felt natural now, like greeting an old friend rather than speaking into the void. I didn't reach for him. I didn't step closer. I let the space remain exactly as it was, honoring whatever quiet agreement had formed between us. The morning stretched around us, unbroken. I became aware then of how rarely I allowed myself to be still with another living being without feeling the need to perform. With people, there was always an undercurrent of expectation, respond, reassure, explain. Here, there was nothing like that. His presence didn't pull at me. It simply existed, solid and unbothered by my internal noise. That realization cracked something open. I leaned my forehead against the fence again, eyes closing as a slow exhale left me. Images surfaced unbidden. Crowded rooms, half-finished conversations, the careful way I'd learned to keep my grief palatable, manageable, so no one else had to feel uncomfortable around it. I thought about how often I'd shrunk myself to fit into spaces that had never asked me to be whole. A soft sound drew my attention back. He had stepped closer, close enough now that his breath brushed my hair, lifting a few loose strands. I stayed still, every nerve awake but not screaming. His presence filled the space beside me, immense and calm, and I felt the absurd urge to lean into it, to rest against something that wouldn't ask me to explain why I was tired. I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I let my hand slide along the fence rail, inching closer to where he stood. My fingers trembled, betraying me, but I didn't pull back. When my knuckles hovered just short of his neck, I paused, giving him the choice. He made it for both of us. He shifted, just slightly, the side of his neck brushing my hand. The contact was firm and warm and utterly real. My breath caught, not in fear, but in the sudden intensity of sensation. I hadn't realized how starved I was for uncomplicated touch that didn't come with memory or expectation until that moment. I let my hand rest there. The muscles beneath his skin moved subtly as he breathed. A slow, powerful rhythm that grounded me more effectively than any practiced coping mechanism ever had. I focused on that movement, letting it anchor me to the present moment, to the here and now, where nothing was required of me except to feel. Tears came then, quiet and steady. I didn't fight them. I didn't analyze them. I simply let them fall, tracking warm lines down my cheeks, disappearing into the collar of my sweater. My hand stayed where it was, fingers splayed, absorbing warmth and life and the undeniable fact that I was not alone in this moment. He didn't move away. If anything, he leaned into the contact, just enough that I felt the weight of his presence shift toward me. It was a small gesture, but it carried a gravity that made my chest ache. It felt like acceptance without conditions, like being allowed to exist exactly as I was. "I don't know how to do this," I whispered, voice rough. "I don't know how to stay." The words surprised me with their honesty. They weren't just about this place or this moment. They were about everything about the way I'd learned to keep one foot always pointed toward the exit, about the fear that if I stayed too long, if I let myself belong, something would be taken from me again. His breathing deepened, a long exhale that seemed to answer without answering. I stayed there until the cold crept back into my fingers, until the tears slowed and my thoughts settled into something quieter. When I finally withdrew my hand, it was with care, as if breaking a fragile seal. He lifted his head, watching me with those dark, reflective eyes, and for a fleeting second, I felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with being understood. That morning marked a shift. Our encounters grew longer, more layered. Sometimes I talked, my words spilling out in uneven fragments. Sometimes I stayed silent, content to exist in the shared space between us. I learned his patterns, how he preferred to stand with the wind at his back, how his ears flicked when distant sounds caught his attention, how he seemed to sense my approach long before I came into view. I learned, too, that the land around us held echoes of a life larger than my quiet walks. There were old structures half hidden by trees, a weathered barn with doors that hung crooked on their hinges. I kept my distance at first, unsure of boundaries I couldn't see, but curiosity eventually nudged me closer. One afternoon, the sky heavy with low clouds, he wasn't by the fence. Instead, I saw him near the barn, standing just outside the open doorway. The sight of him there felt like an invitation, tentative but unmistakable. I approached slowly, my steps measured. The barn smelled of old wood and hay, of damp earth and time. Dust motes drifted in the slanted light, catching and releasing brightness with each small movement of air. He watched me as I crossed the threshold, his posture relaxed but attentive. Inside, the space felt hushed, as if sound itself had learned to tread carefully. I became acutely aware of my own breathing, of the way my boots scuffed softly against the packed dirt floor. My presence here felt more intrusive somehow, more personal. "I won't stay long," I murmured, though I wasn't sure who I was reassuring. He shifted to the side, making room without stepping away entirely. The gesture felt deliberate, a silent negotiation of shared space. I stood a few feet from him, close enough to feel his warmth, far enough to respect the unspoken boundary between us. This place, I realized, was part of his world in a way the fence never was. A swell of emotion rose in me, unexpected and sharp. I thought about all the times I'd hovered at the edges of my own life, afraid to step fully inside, to claim space as mine. Standing here, on the threshold of something that mattered, I felt that familiar urge to retreat. Instead, I stayed. The barn creaked softly as the wind pressed against it. Somewhere, water dripped in a slow, steady rhythm. I rested my hand against a rough wooden post, grounding myself in its solidity. The simple act of being here present, unguarded, felt monumental. He lowered his head slightly, close enough that I could see the fine hairs around his muzzle, the gentle flare of his nostrils. I resisted the impulse to reach out again, choosing instead to let the moment breathe. "Thank you," I said quietly, though gratitude felt too small a word for what I meant. I didn't know then how deeply this place, this connection, would come to matter to me. I didn't know how much it would ask of me in return. All I knew was that something essential was unfolding in the quiet, something that couldn't be rushed or controlled. As I left the barn that day, the sky finally opened, rain beginning to fall in a soft, steady curtain. I paused just outside, letting the droplets soak into my hair and coat, feeling the chill seep in without flinching. Behind me, the sound of heavy breathing followed, steady and sure, not chasing, not retreating. Just there, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to believe that staying might not be the same as losing. And for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to believe that staying might not be the same as losing. The rain followed me home that day, soaking through my coat, clinging to my hair, but I didn't rush it away. I moved slowly, deliberately, letting the cold remind me that I was still here, still capable of feeling. By the time I reached the cottage, my hands were numb, my cheeks flushed, my chest humming with something that felt dangerously close to hope. That night, I dreamed without edges. There was no sharp beginning, no jolt awake in the dark, just the sensation of movement steady, rhythmic, forward, breath and warmth, and the low vibration of something powerful beside me. When I woke, dawn was already creeping through the window, and for a few disoriented seconds, I felt an unfamiliar peace settle over me like a held note. It scared me. Peace has always felt temporary to me, something you enjoy cautiously, waiting for the moment it's snatched away. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet, half expecting it to betray me. When it didn't, when the silence stayed gentle and unthreatening, I exhaled and sat up. The days began to blur into one another after that, not in a dull way, but in a fluid one, like water flowing around stones. My walks became anchors, my meetings with him, the quiet center around which everything else revolved. I started timing my days less by clocks and more by light, by weather, by the subtle shifts in my own body. I noticed how my appetite returned slowly, cautiously, as if testing the ground, how sleep came easier, how my shoulders no longer lived permanently hunched near my ears. None of it was dramatic. None of it announced itself as healing. It just happened. There were still hard moments. Some mornings, the fog felt heavier, pressing down on me with memories I hadn't invited. I would stand by the fence, hands clenched, chest tight, words lodged in my throat like splinters. On those days, I didn't force myself to speak. I didn't pretend to be okay. I simply stood there, letting his presence exist beside mine without trying to fix anything. Those were the days I learned the most. I learned that connection doesn't always look like comfort. Sometimes it looks like endurance, like standing in the cold with someone who doesn't flinch when you're quiet, who doesn't demand that you be lighter, easier, more pleasant. One afternoon, the sky bruised purple and gray, wind bending the grass low. I arrived to find the fence empty and the field restless. The air felt charged, unsettled. I hesitated, an old anxiety rising in my chest. But instead of turning back, I followed the curve of the land toward the barn. The doors were open wide, creaking softly in the wind. Inside, he stood deeper than usual, near the back wall, his posture tense in a way I hadn't seen before. His head was high, ears flicking rapidly, his breathing faster, less even. The sight of him like that, unsettled, wary, hit me harder than I expected. I stopped just inside the doorway. "It's okay," I said instinctively, the words leaving me before I had time to consider them. "I'm here." I didn't know who I was, reassuring him or myself, but something in my voice seemed to reach him. His head turned slightly, eyes finding mine. There was a flicker there, brief and raw, that mirrored something in me. I took a step forward, then another. The barn groaned as a gust of wind rattled its frame, sending a shiver through the space. He shifted, hooves scraping the floor, breath flaring. I froze, heart pounding, fear blooming sharp and sudden. Not of him, but of the realization that this mattered enough to hurt. I raised my hands slowly, palms open, my movements careful. "I'm not leaving," I whispered. The words felt like a vow, spoken into a space that had never asked for promises. "You don't have to be calm. You don't have to be anything." He held still, watching me. I closed the distance between us inch by inch, stopping when I was close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, the tremor of tension beneath his skin. Without thinking, without planning, I rested my forehead lightly against his shoulder. The contact was solid, unyielding, real. For a heartbeat, everything seemed to balance on that point: the risk, the trust, the weight of choosing to stay even when fear whispered otherwise. My breath shook as it left me, but I didn't pull away. Neither did he. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, his breathing slowed. The tension beneath my forehead eased, muscle by muscle, until the tremor faded into stillness. I stayed there, eyes closed, counting breaths, letting the storm outside pass without dragging us into it. Something settled between us then, deep and unspoken. It wasn't ownership, it wasn't dependency, it was recognition, the understanding that two beings can share space without trying to control it. That closeness doesn't have to consume, that steadiness can be offered without strings. When I finally stepped back, my eyes burned, my chest tight with emotion I didn't bother naming. He lowered his head, resting it briefly near my shoulder, close enough that his breath warmed my collarbone. The gesture felt like a benediction. After that day, the barn became a place of refuge rather than threshold. I spent hours there some afternoons, sitting on an upturned crate, listening to the quiet symphony of small sounds, the shift of weight, the rustle of hay, the steady cadence of breathing. I brought a book once, but didn't read. The presence was enough. It wasn't long before the outside world intruded. A car appeared one morning near the main drive, unfamiliar and out of place. I watched from the fence as two figures moved through the property, their voices carrying faintly on the air. My stomach tightened, an instinctive protectiveness flaring before I fully understood it. They spoke to me later, polite but firm, explaining plans in careful language, restoration, transfer, changes coming to the estate. I nodded, listened, asked neutral questions. Inside, something cold and heavy settled. Change had found us. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake, staring into darkness, my mind replaying every shared moment, every quiet exchange. Fear threaded through me, not of loss alone, but of regression, of becoming the person who always retreated when things mattered. In the early hours, I made a decision. The next morning, I went to him earlier than usual, the sky barely lightening, frost glittering on the ground. He was already there, standing near the fence, as if he'd sensed the shift before I did. I rested my hand against his neck, no hesitation this time, grounding myself in the warmth and solidity. My breath came unsteady, but my voice didn't falter. "They're going to change things," I said softly. "I don't know what that means yet, but I know this, what we have, what this has been, it matters. It changed me." He breathed out, long and slow. I stayed with him as the light grew, as the day unfolded around us. I didn't cling. I didn't bargain with the future. I simply allowed the weight of the moment to settle, to imprint itself on me. When it was time to leave, I didn't drag my feet. I didn't look back in desperation. I rested my forehead against his one last time, inhaled the familiar scent of earth and life, and let myself feel the fullness of goodbye without rushing to soften it. Walking away hurt, but it was a clean pain, edged with gratitude rather than regret. In the weeks that followed, I learned that staying doesn't always mean remaining in the same place. Sometimes it means carrying what mattered forward, letting it reshape how you move through the world. I still walk the path. Sometimes the field is empty now, quieter than it used to be. But the silence no longer presses against my back like a threat. It breathes differently, steady, familiar. When I hear heavy breathing in the quiet moments of my life, I don't turn away anymore. I stand, I breathe, and I stay.